Are Syria and Lebanon hurtling towards collapse? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Nabih Bulos, Middle East Bureau Chief for the Los Angeles Times. Nabih Bulos, it's a real pleasure to welcome you, or rather to welcome you back to Connections.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I'd like to start with a discussion about Syria. You were recently in Syria. Besides the obvious change of leadership, to what extent has Syria fundamentally changed since last December? And which aspects of change do you consider the most significant?
Well, so I just, so I should say I was lucky enough to be in Syria basically 2 days after Assad fell. So I was in Qatar when Assad fell, and then the moment I heard, I actually raced back to Beirut, which is my home base, and I just took my car and drove across the border. So and I've been multiple times back since. And perhaps the most fundamental change I have to say is that, well, it's hard to overstate the level of control and monitoring that was in place with the old regime, right?
Which you
Just to
also
give
were able to visit during the Civil War. Yeah.
Well, indeed, I was. I managed to get in a few times until they banned me, until I got a ban slapped on me, which, by the way, is still in place. I actually checked on, like every time I go through the border, I just for kicks ask, about what happened to it. And actually, the new government has yet to remove the old bans, but apparently, I had a ban placed on me by the foreign media desk of one of the intelligence branches. I'm not sure why, but in any case, they don't really give you the details as far as I can tell. But yeah, that's the situation. And it's really hard to overstate how much, really monitoring and control there was over what we did as journalists back in the day. Just to give you a sense of this. As a journalist back in the day, I wanted to write a story about how sanctions were affecting the healthcare sector in Syria. Now, I should say, this was a fairly not pro-regime because I don't really operate that way, but let's say it would have been a more sympathetic story to the regime. Only because sanctions are really a blunt tool when it comes to policy, and they do disproportionately affect the public. And in this case, the public was being affected because of the lack of medicines and the lack of access to modern medical equipment. So I thought it was a good story, actually, and I thought that surely the regime, which was always talking about sanctions and their effect, would be happy to, show an American journalist around on this issue. Well, I was wrong. The fact is that every time I tried to talk to a doctor about it, I would get this lecture on medications and things like that, but then nothing really of consequence, and they were always terrified to actually speak their minds in any way, shape, or form. I wasn't given access to the foreign medicine procurement office. Right, there was a procurement office that was set. Specifically for like foreign medications. I was never given access to it, which is to say that they were really quite awful in terms of permissions and things like that. It was really very, very annoying. Sorry, I'm just closing a tab so there's no sound coming
No
in.
problem.
Sorry. Yeah. And also, it should be said that, just to give you a sense of how much freedom there is in that regard, at least, I was able to drive pretty much all across Syria. I say in Arabic, in the Kannast Suriya, I basically swept all of Syria. I went, the first time I just drove basically from Damascus all the way up to Latakia, went up to Kasab at the very edge of the border. Then I came back and hung a right, went all the way to Deir ez-Zor. I just went to Dir'a. And this wasn't a matter of me coordinating with the authorities, right? This was just me going, right? And the notion of me, for example, just going to Dir'a just so I could see, for example, the old train station there, that was, an impossibility, right? Now, of course, it should be said, all this is a function of the new government not, securing control over everything, right? I do think the trend lines are heading towards a return of that kind of control, but for now, that is yet to happen. And they are certainly putting on a positive face about, media freedom and things of that nature.
And if you look at this from the perspective of Syria's citizens, what would be the most significant changes?
Well, for example, just in terms of everyday practical matters, right? Syrian public, especially in the government areas, was basically subject to, well, tons of sanctions, of course, so that was a big problem. But the regime was basically trying its best to control all sources of income that were coming in. This was basically an attempt to grab all dollars. And it makes sense because they didn't have any dollars and they needed hard currency. So, your basic citizen, for example, if they wanted to, well, I mean, if you're a businessman, for example, right? You're a businessman, you got in something, right? You wanted to like then sell it on, right? You would have to pay customs once, maybe twice. You would then be picked up by the security services and blackmailed, until you paid up. For example, just something as simple as buying bread, right, or buying a gas canister, or buying all this stuff. It was all determined via this smart card, al-bitaqa al-dhakiyya, which would tell you when you could go and buy it at a subsidized price. But of course, the queues were very, very long. There was just, it's hard to again overstate how much waiting was involved as a Syrian citizen. You were waiting to get bread, you were waiting to get gas, you were waiting to get, cooking gas, just basic foodstuffs. It was very much a situation where you had a crippled state, right? And people were suffering for that, right? Now, of course, it's a bit different insofar as that, well, for example, bread is no longer subsidized. So it's actually 10 times as much as it used to be, right? At the same time, there are no queues because, well, obviously it's no longer subsidized. On the other hand, you have a problem with the currency. There's just simply not enough paper money, right? So, if I, for example, wanted to get my salary, I would have to wait literally for hours in front of an ATM, and I would get only a small amount, right? There's a limit as to how much I can take. Now we can talk about that in further detail
Sure.
later on, but in quite a few ways, right? The differences are not as stark as you would think, but in others, in fundamental ways. For example, the ability to speak your mind in certain forums, the ability to move around, I think, relatively freely. All that really is there. Now, again, we can argue this is a function of a government not yet securing control, but it is what it is now.
And how does the new leadership perceive the future of Syria? Is its project one of domination by the political group that seized power? Is it aiming for Sunni Arab hegemony of the state? Or is it, what many people would say, contrary to appearances, also seeking to establish a more inclusive polity?
I think if they are seeking to have a more inclusive polity, it would be under the rubric of Sunni Arab hegemony, but those groups would have, let's say, certain symbolic or perhaps certain practical considerations over their particular uh, groups, right? But with that being said, I think it's clear now that they actually do intend to have a centralized, I guess, Damascus authority, right? The intention is to have a centralized state, and they've been very clear on that. And I think that in terms of administering the affairs, right, they have been reluctant, on the idea of having, for example, the Druze administer their own affairs, which was something that should be said that the Assad regime did accept, right? There was a sort of modus vivendi being forged with the Druze, and Assad, which allowed them to control their areas or administer their areas more accurately, to a certain degree, right? I don't see the new government wanting to do that, right? They are more interested in having certainly a centralized Damascus state. And also the problem is that the rhetoric is often put in the sense that it's time for the majority to rule, right? Now this is really code for saying that they want Sunnis to rule, right? And there's this sort of presumption that
It's our turn.
Sunni, well, A, it's our turn, right? And B, there's this presumption that, well, we suffered so much under minorities, right? Surely now it should be us. Now, I think there are, well, several issues with that thesis, right? One of them is that it's hard to say that Assad was a minority-led regime. Yes, the Alawites were there, but it should be said, the Assad family actually, well, it was at the nexus of a group of interests that involved pretty much all the sects. And I think actually one person said it really well. He said it wasn't a matter of the Alawite sect, which is, of course, the sect of Assad, right? But it was more of, an Assad sect, right? He said in Arabic, إنها مش طائفة العلوية هي الطائفة الأسدية وضمت كل الطوائف. It included all the sects, right? If you were part of the coterie of the president, you were well off. If you weren't, whether you were Alawite or Sunni, etc., you simply weren't in the game, right? And it should be said, I mean, Alawites were crushingly poor, right? A lot of my colleagues in Western media would sort of talk about how the Alawites had basically sucked the fat out of the bone of Syria. But the fact is, if you went to their areas, even under Assad, so many of them were truly awfully poor, right? Now, of course, now I'm straying from the main topic here, but yes, the
Well,
idea is.
yes, you did
Right,
you
go ahead,
did stray from the main topic, but I think you raise a very important point that outsiders have a tendency to identify each and every Syrian by their sectarian or tribal or geographic identity and not think of them as Syrians. Whereas many Syrians, they of course had these multiple identities, but also saw themselves as Syrians. Otherwise, the state could have never survived.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the fact is that, yes, of course, there was a sectarian tinge to a lot of the Assad regime's actions, right? Of course, you had, the Shabiha, the thugs that were coming in. A lot of those groups were minority led, whether that was, Alawite Druze or Christian, right? But you also had Sunni gangs too. You see what I mean? It's hard to, again, it's hard to imagine Syria as it was back then without Assad being able to co-opt all different groups. Because the fact is, yes, it's true, Sunnis are the majority, right? Mathematically, it cannot be right that you would have a situation where Alawites, I think, comprise about 11% or maybe 13% of the population, right? It simply mathematically is not possible, right, for them to have, for example, been the entire army, right, that were then dominating the rest of the country, right? Obviously, there were Sunnis there as well. Obviously, the Sunni merchants in Damascus and Aleppo were part of the regime in many ways, right? So, it's been interesting now to see, right, the rhetoric change from, okay, well, it's our turn, as you said, right? And there's this idea of man yuharrir yuqarrir, he who liberates decides, right? With the notion that this Salafi jihadi group that did it, they're the ones who now get to lead. A lot of Syrians are actually quite annoyed about that supposition, and they would like it to be more inclusive.
But that is the way that the leadership sees it. Man yuharrir yuqarrir.
For sure. I think in their heart of hearts, that's how they see it.
Yeah.
Some of them are perhaps smoother than others in terms of how they present it, right? They say, oftentimes you hear people saying the right things. And that includes President Sharer, who I have to say, has spoken quite eloquently, about the notion of inclusivity. But on the ground, things I think are so far anyway quite different.
Yeah.
And well, I hope they'll be. I hope they'll be what he says they should be. But we'll wait and see, I suppose.
Well, getting to that issue, the impression those outside Syria often have is, you have these multiple tensions or conflicts, and the tensions with the Kurds are seen as being driven by the new leadership's determination to establish the supremacy of the central government and because of its alliance with Turkey. The widespread violence in Syria's predominantly Alawite regions is seen as reflecting a combination of communal revenge and efforts to root out the remnants of the ousted Assad regime. And then you have the more recent clashes in the Sweda region, which many believe began as a local conflict between Druze and Bedouin that were then exploited by the new government to establish its supremacy in these regions, to basically reduce or eliminate the autonomy that existed there that you just spoke about. How do you see these characterizations? Are they generally accurate, or are they based on a kernel of truth but camouflage a much different reality?
So I do think they are accurate to a degree, but they do need some more, I think, context to make them perhaps clearer. So, for example, right, in the case of the revenge killings in March, right, the various Alawites.
These were massacres conducted in the Alawite regions.
That's correct. In March, right, where you had, I think, about 1,400 Alawite civilians being massacred, if I'm not mistaken. But I'm not sure about the numbers right now. Now, the fact is that you actually had, I have to say, tens of thousands of Alawites, and former security personnel who very willingly gave up their weapons. Right. In the days after the takeover, you had a general amnesty that was issued, right, as long as they came in and handed over their weapons. And I myself witnessed really. And this was genuinely tens of thousands of men coming in and handing in all the weapons they had, all the jeeps, tanks, everything. Not to mention, you have to say that the army effectively, the word collapsed really understates how it was. If you've ever seen Avengers Endgame or Avengers Infinity War, there's this moment when Thanos snaps his finger and half of them just disappear. It really was like that. I basically traipsed into an airbase, and I just happened to find a fully armed, fully refueled warplane ready to go, and a bunch of army uniforms beside it, almost like the pilots had just been disappeared, right? So it should be said, a lot of people did sign on to this new government, and they really want to give it a chance, right? Now, at the same time, right, you still have grievances, right? There are grievances on both sides. And the fact is that the government did not proceed with a credible transitional justice procedure, right? And I think, in many ways, that sort of inflamed the situation even further, right? Now, at the same time, all three of those crises, right, are basically a matter of centralizing control in Damascus. And it should be said, I think when it comes to the army and things of that nature, it makes sense to do so, right? This notion of having ethnic-based formations, right, or having, let's say, area-specific formations within the armed forces, I think has been one of the major issues we face in the Arab world. And case in point is the tension, really the constant tension between the Peshmerga, right, the Iraqi Peshmerga forces, right, that operate in Iraqi Kurdistan,
Yeah.
and the regular military, right, the regular Iraqi military, right. We have seen tensions between them for this very reason. So I do understand the motivation of the government to want to centralize at least weapons under their umbrella, right, without having these separate formations. Now, at the same time, the motivations that happen, for example, for the Druze, right, there again, you have a situation where, what happened in March made the Druze more reluctant to hand over their weapons. There was actually, talk and we can argue about how, advanced or perhaps how sincere those talks were, right? But they were advancing, right? And then you immediately saw after what happened in March that there was this pullback, and after what happened with the Druze as well. More recently, the Kurds now are very much against the notion of handing over their weapons. And again, it makes sense, right? You are talking about, these irregular forces that are now operating under the government's umbrella, and yet, they pretend to be regular forces when they are basically militias and factions. So the problem is that the government itself has not gone forward with the process of demilitiazation, if you will, right? Or defactionalization of its armed forces. And so it's a bit rich for them to then turn around and ask other groups to do so, especially after the level of violence that we've seen.
But on that point, I think you'll hear two different responses. Some will say, well, the fundamental problem here, just leaving the Kurds aside for a moment, because that's much more of a negotiation between the central government and well-organized Kurdish authorities. The fundamental problem here is that the government does not yet have control over its former militias, let's say. And other people will say, no, that's not really the problem. The problem is that these militias are doing the government's bidding, and it's only pretending not to have control over them.
Well, it's a good question, isn't it? The fact is that I think it's a bit of both, right? Did Sharia want those militias to engage in horrific extrajudicial killings, right, and revenge killings? Probably not. Did he want them to advance as a horde and descend upon the coast and put down any putsch attempt? Yes, right. I mean that's clear, right? You had a situation where you had mosques, in Idlib, right, calling for nafir, this notion of rising to jihad, right, and going to fight. Same thing happened, with the Bedouins, etc., the Druze. Now, at the same time, right, the government is trying to create a more formalized military. I actually spoke with one Syrian official. I can't really say who, right, because it was an off-the-record chat, but I do know that they've been trying to, I guess, educate the army corps, right, on what they should do. Now, how successful those efforts will be remains to be seen, obviously, right? But they do realize the problem that they're facing in terms of at least the lack of discipline, among these various groups. Now, at the same time, is it a card in Sharia's hand that he can basically, just call upon this group to rise up whenever? Of course it is, right? The fact is, he can actually now go to the Americans and say, hey, look, without me, you can't control them, which, It's not a bad thesis, right? It's probably true, right? But at the same time, let's say tomorrow he were to actually move decisively against these militias, right? What would they do, right? I mean, ironically, the person who succeeded in destroying the militias, right, that he had encouraged in the first place in Syria was actually Assad, right? Back in the day, right? In the Aleppo situation, in the Aleppo fight, he had managed to call upon, and he himself had stood up quite a few militias, right, that were these called Quwat Radife, right, auxiliary forces, right, within the military. And there was a big question after the Aleppo War when those groups were really committing horrific violations and were actually really just basically rapacious, right, in their looting and things like that, right? The question arose as to whether he could control them. And frankly, he could. He managed to actually, destroy them and disband them, and put the ones who refused to work elsewhere, right, under his military. So that is something.
And if we just focus a bit more, particularly on Sweden, you mentioned that we need to understand what happened there in the context of what happened in March in the coastal regions, and the growing hesitancy of Druze leaders to accept assurances from the central government about handing over their weapons and so on. In your view, did it start as a local conflict between Druze and Bedouin forces, or just even between individuals that then took on this broader character? Was it instigated by the new government? How do you see that specific development?
Well, so these things have been going on for a while, right? There have been tensions. Historically, there have been some tensions between the Bedouins and the Druze, right, for a while. And historically, there were
Basically, a
before.
conflict over resources and land and so on.
Well, yes, but even more recently, right? You had a situation where, for example, you had kidnappings and lootings, right? On the road that connects Sweden to Damascus, right? Because it runs through some Bedouin areas at some point. And it should also be said, you had Bedouins that were living in Druze-dominated areas because they were working there, right? A lot of them were working in the fields, right? Or they were, running businesses that other Druze perhaps were not, right? So you had a situation where there was some interaction, and yes, more recently there had been tensions and there had been a spate of kidnappings happening. Now, the issue is, and the timing on this is a bit screwy, perhaps, right? Pardon my French there, but nevertheless, right? Let's put it this way, right? It seems that the spark for all this was the kidnapping of a certain Druze vegetable seller. This then, led to a revenge kidnapping, if you will, right, of a Bedouin group. This then led to the Bedouins coming into Druze areas, fights increasing on both sides. And, at some point in time, you had this notion that the government was going to come in and really just, quell the situation, right? Because the Bedouins were now calling upon other Bedouins to come in and fight. And indeed, you have people from Jordan actually sort of, let's go, coming in from the tribes, right? And it should be said, these tribes, they are cross-border in many ways. Now, this is where it gets a bit strange, right? Because the fact is that, just as the Bedouins were coming in, right, there was also word that you had government forces also coming in, but masquerading as Bedouins, right? And I have it on, from a few credible sources, from people, who would know, right, that they saw some of their friends who are normally fighters from Idlib, right, who are very much with HTS, right, who basically came in and they were dressed in Bedouin garb and were coming in to fight in there, right? So that was one part of it, right? So there was a sense that the government was trying to take advantage of the situation to go in and impose its control. Because it should be said, right, all this was happening on the backdrop of tensions between the government and the Druze over who would administer the area, right? Now, it seems that what happened then, as far as I can tell, from speaking to various people, is that when the government finally came in, right, you also had a situation where basically they started committing violations, right? And in fact, at the time, Sheikh Hikmat al-Hajari, who is sort of now the top Druze leader, right, the top Druze religious chieftain, he basically had accepted a ceasefire agreement, but of course was quite angry about it, right, because he knew it was a way to basically get the government to get into the place and impose its control. And then midway through, as they were coming in, he basically said, well, they violated the ceasefire and we're going to fight back. But it should be said, I heard from quite a few Druze that even at that point, right, there were already violations being committed. And then the fact
By
is,
government
if
forces.
yes, and if Hajri hadn't actually declared that he was going to do that, they were already fighting, right? It seems that Hajri actually rode the wave of what was already a popular resistance that was starting at that moment. And I should add, having spent a few days in Sweden, right? You know, I think it's fair to say that Hajri's was not a majority point of view, but after what happened, it very much is. And that's the problem, right? For a lot of people, there is no going back, right? And I mean, of course, that sounds more dramatic than perhaps it is. But I mean, think of it. If your family has been massacred in a horrific fashion, would you accept to be part of this new state? I don't know. I think it would be hard to do so.
Finally, on Syria, it's of course facing monumental economic challenges, which arguably form a greater threat to its new rulers' hold on power and the stability of the Syrian state than communal or political conflict of the type we've been discussing. How's the government seeking to address these challenges, and is it succeeding?
It's a great question. I can tell you this much. The government has scored a coup in the lifting of sanctions. That is, again, it's hard to overstate, and I hate overusing that phrase, but it really is appropriate in this case. It's hard to overstate how bad things were because of the sanctions, right? I mean, something as simple as I'm just giving an example, right? Let's say you wanted to, for example, update the software on your MRI machine in your hospital, right? The moment that machine realized you were in Syria, boop, there it goes, and your machine was bricked, right? Banking, anything that involved banking, of course, you would have to do like all these all these games, all these transfers to try to hide where things were going. You would send it to Beirut, you would send it elsewhere. I mean, it really, really was quite onerous, right? Even to the point where Jordan, which really used to view Syria as its lung, as its economic lung, right? Jordan was completely cut off, right? They could no longer do anything because of the fear that any interaction with the Syrian entity, right, would then basically impose secondary and even tertiary sanctions, which would mean that you would lose access to the SWIFT system, you would lose access to dollars, and you would get, on the blacklist for OFAC, and you would lose the American market, which a lot of companies were simply not willing to do, right? So it should be said, the ability, the fact that they got the sanctions lifted, at least in name, is a big deal.
And have
At the
they
same
been
time,
lifted in practice or just a statement of intent?
it's a statement of intent only because this stuff takes time. And the fact is that even that, for it to be lifted, right, there are quite a few logistical hurdles that need to be, passed in Congress and elsewhere, right? And the fact is, it's not just a matter of, a wand and it's gone, right? You do need to do this in a legal fashion and go through the procedure only because, if you don't, companies will not be willing to risk it, right? Even if I say it today, right? If they don't see something in 6 months that is concrete in terms of taking those actions, they won't dare to do it because, the fact is, again, it's so onerous to do business with Syria, right? Again, just another example. There was this one bank called Commerzbank, which was the main bank or the main correspondent bank that Syrian merchants could work with. And at some point in time, the sheer number of compliance officers needed to vet every deal was simply not worth the deal size, right? So they basically said, look, guys, sorry, you're just not worth it. And they, cut them off, right? They basically closed the accounts of every Syrian client and they refused to do business with Syria because the volume was simply not there, right? So that's a big deal. At the same time, the issue is that the government now seems to be in many ways recycling the old plans of the government, of the Assad government. So for example, we've seen them take over businesses and institutions that were led by the front man or the economic front man, more accurately, of the former regime, this guy named Saad Ibrahim. They've commandeered them, right? And they've basically taken the revenue and diverted it to their own, obviously, governmental coffers and things of that nature. Now, of course, you could argue that that's a good thing, right? Because at the same time, right, had they been stuck in litigation, they wouldn't have gotten anything. It would have been very onerous. It would have taken a very long time. But this has actually caused problems for people who believe that, well, if these, mafia-like businessmen can continue, right, to operate, then how safe is the environment really for them to actually go and invest? That's one, right? At the same time, you're also seeing them trying to invest in a way which is, well, privatization heavy, right? Which is to say that they want to take the various assets of the government, sell them, right? And in some cases, they want to try to do this sort of, BOT thing where they build, operate, transfer, or try to get some money out of it, like a profit sharing agreement, etc. But for a lot of Syrians, this is a problem because you're talking about, for example, these projects that involve, skyscrapers in the middle of Damascus, right? Or, this idea of taking a land of former ministries and turning it into malls and things of that nature, right? Now, the fact of the matter is, does Syria really need skyscrapers and malls right now? Who's going to live in them? Who can afford to, right? We're talking about a country that remains to be very, very, very poor. And every time I go back to Syria, I'm struck anew by how poor the country is, right? And that's awful to say because, it wasn't through the fault of the people, right? It was through the fault of the leadership, right? But Syrians are by no means lazy people. They're very hardworking, very resourceful, right? And they have succeeded, really everywhere they've gone to, whether in Egypt, the UAE, etc., right? And to see the country so saddled, right, with this situation right now is really quite infuriating. Now, do I think they'll be able to, go past it? I don't know, but I can tell you this much. I personally don't think that the projects that they've been focusing on, which is to say this beautification project of parts of Damascus, turning it into a mall, etc. I don't think these premium projects are what the country needs, right? This country needs to have infrastructure fixed up. It needs massive investment in water and electricity. Water is a huge problem. Damascus is about to be one of the first Arab, well, maybe the first Arab capital, like to lose all fresh water. It's a disaster, right? Electricity right now comes about an hour a day. There was this idea of trying to bring it in, for 10 hours. That's yet to happen. I have certainly heard of plans to rehabilitate some of these stations, bringing in Siemens, or some other foreign companies that were not able to work in the past. And again, it's important to say that the sanctions basically sanctioned all the government of Syria, right? So, you had various entities, like the central bank was sanctioned, obviously the military, and of course, various, I guess, ministries as well. So there was no work to be done really, right? Now there's an attempt to do that, right? Now that's changing. Now, the long-term prospects, honestly, I'm unsure. The country needs tons of investment. I don't know who's going to do it, and I don't know if they'll do it in a way which will preserve what Syria was for a lot of people, right? Um, I don't think Syria can afford. I don't think Damascus should become a Dubai, for example, right? But that seems to be the direction the new leadership wants to go. So, that's my 2 cents. I'm not Syrian. I have no right to speak about that, right? But at the same time, I do feel it's not the right path.
And if the government fails to address these issues that you've identified.
Look, people have been saying for the last few weeks now that the new regime's days are numbered, right? The Sharia's days are numbered. That may be so, but the fact is, who will do it? Who will fight? Right? Who's going to actually go ahead and pick up a gun and fight all these groups to bring him down? Really, right? We can talk a big game about it, but the fact is that you don't have the international support at this point for a dethroning of Sharia, if only because there's no clarity as to who would come later. Let's be clear. If we could have the Harvard MBA educated fighter who manages to command the respect of all of his men, and sort of speaks, has like a Sontag like understanding of women's equality and all that stuff, whoop-de-doo, bring him in, right? I would be happy to see this person or her or whoever, right? But the fact is, we are dealing with a situation where the country is now led by militias, right? We are seeing a situation where, in some ways, it's a recycling of what happened in Lebanon post-civil war. Look at the people who are leading Lebanon now. These are former militiamen for the most part, right? And, the fact is that they have become very adept at maintaining power. And I think that the new Syrian government will be just as adept at maintaining power as well. I would be hard pressed to think of who would be able to take them on.
You mentioned Lebanon, and I'd now like to turn to Lebanon. Its domestic politics appear transformed since Israel's offensive against Hezbollah last year and the installation of a new president and prime minister. To what extent has there been real change in Lebanon's political landscape?
Look, it's a good question. The fact is that had you asked me this question a few weeks ago, I'd have said this is, smoke and mirrors, because again, who's going to go in and actually take the weapons, right? the fact is that, in the South, right? So let's separate first of all, right? There's the notion of weapons being taken in the south of the Litani, which is, say, South Lebanon, and
Hezbollah
there's,
weapons.
yes, Hezbollah weapons,
Mm,
and there are weapons to be taken from elsewhere, right?
mm.
Other parts of the country. Now, I think that the stuff happening in South Lebanon, that's a done deal, right? The Hezbollah has accepted that, and that is actually going on as we speak, right? And it should also be said that Israel has managed to achieve in the ceasefire, or more accurately, in breaking the ceasefire, right, what it could not do in war. So again, just to explain what I mean by that, if you look at the sort of 5 kilometer wide strip along the border between Lebanon and Israel,
On the
Israel's
Lebanese
plan,
side.
yes, right, Israel's plan was to depopulate that area, right, and essentially create a no man's land. Now, it should be said, they couldn't do it on the ground, despite having obviously very fine grained intelligence and despite having a superior air force on hand, right? And not to mention intelligence services from all over the world helping them out, right? Now, although they were able to suss out all the various positions and the locations, in terms of fighting on the ground, the Israeli army was not able to advance as much as it wanted to, right? They could not go in and clean that area, right? Because the fighters on the ground stopped them. Once the ceasefire happened, that's when they did it. And in fact, you can see it. If you drive in that area, there's almost a line, Wayne. It's crazy. Like you go through Naura, right? Naura is one of these border towns, right? As you drive up Naura's main thoroughfare, in the beginning, it's okay. There's like some damage, but nothing major, right? Some house here, some house there. And then you go through this one line, almost like there's like a line, and then nothing is standing after it. And as you drive along that thoroughfare, that then passes through a whole bunch of other villages, Marwahin, Dhira, a few others, you can see that it was systematic. Not a single structure stands.
And
And
this was,
80%
and this is demolitions after the ceasefire agreement was reached?
80% of that happened after the ceasefire.
Mm,
Really.
mm.
80% of that happened after the ceasefire. And you have had thousands of violations of a ceasefire, so much so that, it's hard to sort of, call it a ceasefire, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to make a vulgar joke about celibacy here, but, you can get the, you can get the point, right? Like, are you really celibate if you're, anyway, moving on.
But
So,
I do want to discuss Israel's role and Hezbollah's weapons, of course. But my question was mainly about looking at the political landscape in Beirut
right,
and to what
right.
extent
So,
there has been real change there.
I think that there is a will, right? There certainly is a will, right, to appear to have, real change. I think at the same time that Hezbollah has not been cornered yet, right? I think there's still a feeling, right, among Hezbollah cadres that they will not give up the weapons and things of that nature, right? Right. That's been the main rhetoric. And we haven't seen a serious attempt by the army yet to disarm Hezbollah in areas outside of the south of Lebanon, right? I think it's all fun and games until we see that. With that being said, are we hearing a firmness from the Lebanese government that we never heard before? Of course.
Mm.
But it has also spurred an important debate. I mean, the fact is this the best time to basically disarm, right? Yes, now we can argue about the legitimacy of those weapons under Hezbollah, etc. But is this the best time to disarm when you have, what is clearly an expansionist Israel, willing to go the extra mile to do whatever it wants, right? And also having, a very pliant U.S. administration on, behind them. I mean, is this the best time to do so? These are questions that have not been satisfactorily answered. And the fact is that despite all of this, right? I mean, the Lebanese army remains woefully underarmed and under-equipped, really. I mean, we are talking about, I mean, again, just to give an example, if you go to the north, there's a base there that's run by the Americans, and they've given the Lebanese the A-29 Super Tucano, a propeller fighter plane, and the MD-50 helicopter, right?
This
Both
is
of
the
these are
18th
basically
century version of the F-35. Mm,
effectively, right? And these things are basically, I mean, they're holdovers from the Afghanistan Air Force,
mm. So it's
right? The
basically a
Afghan Air Force.
militia.
I mean, in effect,
Mm,
right? In terms of the weapons that they have, right? And at the same time, the army has not been tested in any real fashion. We have not seen the army actually fight Israel in a way that would prove itself able to protect the country,
mm.
right? Now we can again argue about Hezbollah, right, and what it has done, right, and how effective its weapons have been. That is a very, very valid argument, and that's one the Lebanese are having right now, right? This whole notion of mu'adalat al-rada', right? If you had spent any time in the South, you always heard the phrase mu'adalat al-rada', right? The
Balance
notion
of
of
deterrence.
exactly, right, which ended up being no deterrence at all. It has to be said, right? This idea that we will destroy Tel Aviv if you hit the Dahya never happened, right? And there have been real questions within the community, right? From Shiites, from Hezbollah loyalists, right, as to where these weapons were, right? Like why weren't they used, right? What happened, right? These are urgent questions that the Hezb, as far as I know, has yet to answer properly.
There seem
At
to
the
be
same time,
two main explanations for that. One is that Israel successfully destroyed them. Another is that Hezbollah's most advanced weapons were subject to an Iranian veto on their use, and it did not receive permission. What's have you been able to look into this?
well, so what is clear is that the lower quality weapons,
Hmm.
right? Those were more decentralized in the
Hmm.
decision-making process, right? So even when the Sayyid was assassinated, right? Even when all this stuff was happening, those cells continued to operate autonomously, right? At the same time, yes, I think for the higher quality stuff, I may not subscribe to the idea that it's only Iranian veto or it's only Iranian influence that determines their use. But I think it's true that the higher level commanders were simply not able to get in touch with the cadres that would have launched those weapons. Again, if you consider the level of intelligence penetration, and I'm actually working on this now, and I've been sort of obsessing over it for quite some time now, right? Just to get a sense of what we're talking about, right? This was really a moment where Hezbollah could not trust its landline network. This was something it had been relying on since 2008, and now this was infiltrated at every level, right? Add to that they had, it's clear they must have had a systems level penetration when it comes to also other kinds of communication, but also even the database of fighters, right? So with all that being said, I am convinced that although those capabilities may have been there, right, the ability to push the trigger was now gone. Whether that's because of Iranians or higher level Hezbollah members, that's a separate matter. I don't know enough to speak to that, but I can tell you that there is a lot of anger inside the group now because the feeling was, look, we could tell they were already escalating, right? September proved that,
Why
right?
did
The
we
first
wait?
day, why wait? And in fact, I think this actually has proven to be a lesson to militant groups everywhere that when you fight, you don't fight piecemeal. You don't do this adult in the room behavior, which you have to admit, Hezbollah was. Hezbollah was the adult in the room in the sense that they didn't want to escalate. And now, think tankers tend to use the phrase escalation dominance, one of these sort of new catchphrases that are used. But it is apropos in this case because Israel did have escalation dominance, right? And every time the Hezbollah would be like, no, let's take it easy, we'll do this. And they paid the price for it. They didn't get a sense of the long game.
So continuing on the issue of Hezbollah and its weapons, the key issue that we've been reading about in the news and that we're just discussing concerns the future of Hezbollah and particularly of its weapons. A general impression seems to be, and I think you've more or less confirmed this, that although the movement is weakened, it remains a formidable force, whether in military terms or in terms of its domestic power in Lebanon, and that it's not going to capitulate to demands by either the Lebanese government or the government's foreign backers to disarm, particularly so while Israeli forces remain on Lebanese soil and the threat of a new war with Israel remains quite real. So, how do you see this issue playing out?
The fact is, it's hard to say because the loyalists among Hezbollah, right, they do want it to remain, if only because they need to get compensation for what happened, right? There are people who rely on Hezbollah for so much, whether that's education, right, whether that's merely actually getting the money to repair your home, right? And again, we have to contrast Hezbollah in 2006 when it was flushed with money and was able to mobilize quickly and rebuild the Dahi versus now when it is weakened, for, certainly financially, right, and certainly in terms of the weapons, right. It does not have the power it used to have, whether in terms of getting the money or rallying, etc. Right. At the same time, yeah, you have now occupied land, and the government has yet to come up with a credible plan for regaining it.
Mm.
Right. So, I mean, do I think Hezbollah is in a tougher position than it's ever been? Yes. Do I think that it's also completely down and out and will not lash out in a violent fashion if truly threatened? I think it can. I think it will. Right. At the same time, there are legitimate grievances that need to be dealt with. Right. The fact is that for so long, right, a lot of Lebanese treat the South as an auxiliary part of the country. Right. Now, this might be a function of 18
This goes
years of
back
Israeli.
decades.
Yeah. Right. But and there really is a sense that, like when Lebanese talk nostalgically about the golden era, the 60s and things like that, they forget that the Shia were downtrodden peasants and were considered to be basically, the rabble that can stay out of Beirut. Right. So, I mean, the fact is, I understand the impetus to want to disarm Hezbollah, and I get the notion that one should not have a non-state actor with weapons, especially one as well trained and as well, as capable as Hezbollah was.
Yeah,
Right?
but those kinds of arguments are usually made in states where there's a real army.
That's the problem, right? And the fact is that at the same time, the countries that are pushing for Hezbollah to disarm are the same countries that will insist that the Lebanese army remains weak because of its they don't want it to have any kind of edge over Israel, right? So this is the problem. What do you do, right? And I get the dilemma that's facing both Lebanese people and Hezbollah people in this sense, because it really is, it feels like a trap on both sides. And at the same time, if you look around you, right, just look at Syria again, for example, right? I mean, back in the day, we had so much talk about how Assad, didn't fire a bullet for 40 years, at the Zionist, blah, 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 all that, all that rhetoric. And it's true, he didn't, right? But at the same time, the moment that he fell, right, the Israelis took advantage of it to chomp off a bigger part of Syria. And I can tell you that, for example, I consider Jordan, right? I mean, I'm in Jordan right now. Jordan is a country that has made peace with Israel for decades and, has proven to be, a true partner for peace, right? We can criticize it for that if you like, but, that is a fact, right? With that being said, if tomorrow, right, King Abdullah were toppled, do I expect the Israelis to honor any kind of agreement with the Jordanians? No, I think they would actually go in and take a big chunk of it, right? So, just as I understand the Lebanese desire to want to have all arms under one official authority, right, and not wanting to have a rival authority in different parts of the city, I also understand, right, that people do not want to be left with no protection whatsoever. And the Lebanese army so far is no protection whatsoever, so far anyway.
Turning now to another dilemma that affects all Lebanese. The country has been experiencing an acute economic crisis. Many would call it economic collapse for much of the past decade. Where do things stand currently?
The sad part is that, within all the trouble that has happened, right, within all the stuff that has been happening because of the last 22 months of the war in Gaza, that has taken a back burner, and the banks in Lebanon, which were the sort of the main culprits of what happened, right, the main culprits behind the collapse, they've been allowed to essentially operate really scot-free, right? There has been no punishment for these people. They have gotten away with it, which is to say that, the notion of capital controls, which should have happened in the very beginning. I mean, again, just to explain to you how bad this was, right? Lebanon is a country, right, of bankers, and yet, right, the banking crisis that happened in 2019 was more badly managed than what the Taliban were able to do. The Taliban, post, like U.S. withdrawal, right, when the country's economy was completely destroyed or really undercut, right, they actually managed to control it, right, in a better, more responsible fashion than your average Lebanese banker. And that is a frightening thing to see. Yeah. I mean, the fact is that the Afghani, right, the Afghan currency didn't fall anywhere near as much as the Lebanese one. And I should remind you that when we were, in the beginning talking about economic collapse in Lebanon, our idea was that you would have a threefold devaluation of the lira. It was far, far more than that. It's now far more than that, right? We went from, like $1 equaling 1,500 Lebanese lira to 90,000, 89,000 to be exact, right? There was a belief that it would only be 5,000, actually in the worst case scenario, right? So, the fact is all that we're seeing in terms of solutions or in terms of, alleviation of this stuff is all these small piecemeal measures. So, for example, recently the central bank issued a new circular forcing banks to give out a larger amount of USD per withdrawal, assuming, of course, you have the funds, right? Clearly, right? So, for example, I have $3,000, right, in Lebanese banks lost in the ether, right? I haven't bothered to, get them back. I will eventually, perhaps, but it's a lot of work. Before, I would have to go get maybe like $100 every month. Now they've increased that amount, but it's still
This
very,
is a
very onerous.
maximum you're allowed to withdraw of your own money.
Well, yes, exactly. Right. The ironic part of all this is that they basically put capital controls on the people who have small, tiny needs, right? Even while allowing people who are obviously more powerful and more influential to move vast amounts of money. And we're talking in the millions and tens of millions, right? In fact, I know for a fact, right, from a number of banker friends of mine, again, I can't really name names, right, that at the beginning of the crisis, you had tens of millions of dollars being routinely moved in the first days, right?
To
So
avoid the capital controls.
of course, which ironically enough never came, right? But they also wanted to quickly, take advantage of the situation when it came to the value of the lira at that point.
Yeah.
And I should also say, right, that the Lebanese lira's devaluation brought on huge opportunities for arbitrage in a massive, massive way, to the point where people made a lot of money because of that stuff. And not just, like your normal person. We're talking about like officials, right? Not just businessmen, but officials came in and they made a ton of money out of it, as always in Lebanon. And there is no sense in the horizon of any kind of accountability coming in. And that's the sad part, I have to say. Now, with all that being said, right? Yes, there's a war on, and that has really, really ruined the economy. But the fact is, and again, I'm going to avoid using words like resilience because I despise that word and find it overused.
Thank you.
Right? But you bet, right? I hate that word. But at the same time, right, you will find that the Lebanese economy was able to deal with the situation in a better fashion than the Syrian one. Now, again, we are going back to when Assad was still in power, right? But I had a Syrian businessman friend of mine who told me that when the crisis first began in 2019, and also it's worth noting that the Syrian lira and the Lebanese lira were very much linked in terms of value because of the vast amounts of monies deposited by Syrians in Lebanon, right? So when that banking sector was affected, it instantly affected the Syrian lira. So, my friend was telling me that, as a Syrian businessman, he was going back and forth between Lebanon and Syria. And when the crisis occurred in 2019, he saw that both countries were equally affected in terms of what was happening. But 2 years on, right, he found that Lebanon had maybe not fully recovered, but let's say was on the way to recovery, where Syria was not, right? And the large reason for that is because of the decentralization of Lebanon, right? I mean, the reason why a lot of people enjoy living in Lebanon, right, versus other Arab countries, is because it is so decentralized in its decision making, is because it's so shambolic in many ways that you can operate within these grooves, right? Now, obviously, there are problems with that too, right? Logistical problems, as you can imagine, right? Certainly in terms of services and things like that. But it does allow for private enterprise to flourish, as far as I can tell. And that seems to have worked for now for them. Now, has it worked for everyone? Of course not. Are people sort of still suffering because of it? Of course. I know people who, whose pensions are now worth pennies. It's pathetic, right? People who worked 30 years for the state, they could look forward to a $2,000 a month pension, now worth $30.
Wow.
Look, let's be clear. I was a violinist in the orchestra, right? And that was a state entity back in the day, right? My salary was about $2,200, right? That salary would now be $31, roughly speaking. So, right?
Wave it goodbye.
It's just not tenable, right? I mean, that's what happened. Now, of course, the orchestra has now tried to recover and is paying people, a better wage, but it's nowhere near what it used to be, right? And it will take time for it to be able to reconstitute itself in the way that it used to in the past. With all that being said, I do think that it is a matter of time. And of course, no wars. That's key, right? If you had 17 years of no wars, maybe we'll have something.
That's perfectly setting up my final question. While being keenly aware of the interplay between domestic and foreign dynamics, I did very much want to focus on the domestic aspects of Syria and Lebanon before bringing in the foreign aspects, but you found it impossible to answer my questions without referring to Israel, Western sanctions, and so on, just showing how deeply enmeshed these factors are. And so, for my final question, I'd like to ask you one thing that has not changed in either Lebanon or Syria is the level of foreign intervention, particularly by Israel, but not by Israel alone. To what extent do you see regional and foreign forces exacerbating the crises in these countries or contributing eventually to resolving them?
Contributing to resolving them, for sure not. Right? I don't think that's the point. So, if I can be blunt, I'll put it to you this way. My conviction after having seen the last 22 months of what happened in Gaza, and having seen, politicians, in the U.S. and Europe, etc., dealing with the various, countries neighboring Israel, I think it's fair to say that there is a strong, I think, viewpoint that says that Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, all those countries can be subjugated in the name of guaranteeing Israel's security and prosperity, right? And the way I've been seeing things lately, and I hate to say it this way, but I'm going to go ahead and say it, is that we, the people in those countries are seen as livestock, right? You know, if you are a farmer who owns a cow, right, you want the cow to produce milk. So you want the cow to be comfortable insofar as it can produce milk, right? But you don't want the cow to be, luxurious, because who cares about its luxury, right? Right? It won't produce more milk, right? Or the marginal value, of the extra milk will be less than the, marginal cost of providing that luxury. And I have to say, I think very much that the Americans view us in that way, right? We as Arab peoples in the region, we are viewed essentially as livestock that are there to simply, work within a certain framework of our countries, right? Maybe achieve some level of prosperity, but these higher level aspirations, the notion of freedom of speech, the notion of being able to speak your mind, the notion of being able to have, your rights in an international setting, right? The notion of your country being seen as an important enough country to have its rights, for self-defense being sacrosanct, all these things, that's just not there, right? Our borders are not set because, well, it's just a bunch of Arab countries. Who cares, right?
And those
Everything
borders
seems,
can be shifted at the discretion
yeah,
of
absolutely.
of the state that really matters.
Absolutely, right. And and we've heard that time and again from various officials, right? That there is simply no respect for Arab countries as governments and as peoples, right? Whereas, you all see, all you hear really is how, Israel has a right, to defend itself. Israel has a right to basically, be secure, etc. But where are the rights of the Arab peoples involved?
They're
I'm not even talking
subordinate
about Palestine.
rights.
Well, yes, I'm not even talking about like Palestinians. I'm talking about like,
Yeah.
Jordanians, Syrians, etc. Right? They're simply, and the fact is that this is a growing sense among many people, right? Uh, and the fact is that the policies that we are seeing, right? It's hard to imagine any of these policies leading to a more prosperous Middle East. I hear some people talking about how, oh, this is the golden age of the Middle East. But the fact is that, creating a few deals with, rich Gulf nations that are backed by vast amounts of resources, right? This doth not a golden Middle East make, right? And just because, Assad has fallen, right? Now we can argue about how good or bad Assad was. I personally, hated the guy and thought he was bad for Syria. But at the same time, right, the fact is that, are things better off now? Who's to say, right? We don't know yet. But I would be hard pressed to imagine that the Americans have Syria's best interests at heart, especially when it comes to the notion of the state's viability. Again, just give you an example of this, right? Right now, Israel occupies wide tracts of southern Syria, including, I should add, 40% of its water resources. Now, I should also add that those water resources are vital for Jordan. So right now, immediately, right, you have two countries whose very existence, right, something as basic as drinking water, right, is now under threat. And what's the response to all that? Nothing. Right? The Americans seem to just not even think about it. Right?
If they're even aware of it, because these issues are of
They're
no
aware.
concern to them. Yeah.
Of course, simply, right? And the sense is that even when they do pretend to care, they're dealing with things in such a superficial fashion. And it should also be said that the leadership at the top is too erratic to have a consistent line. Now, this is not to say that the Biden era was some golden age. If anything, it was, I think, the nadir of U.S. foreign policy in the region. But at the same time, right, there was a through line. Yes, a terrible through line, one that I very much, did not accept, right? And the reason why I speak as I do now, right? But nevertheless, a through line. Now, what's the through line? Where is it? Where is any kind of, give me one consistent value that we've seen. And the fact is that, with that being said, I think it's fair to say that, yes, Netanyahu has proven to be more effective than most other actors on the scene. And frankly, if I were Israeli, I would vote for Netanyahu, 100%. Yes, he's gambled. Yes, he, as onerous as his policies may be, right? If I were an Israeli, I think that he's done a good job because he has gambled time and again, and he has won. Whereas, give me one Arab leader who has actually managed to stop him, right? Give me one U.S. leader
Or tried.
or even tried. And the fact is that, there is a level of exhaustion, right, with the Palestinian cause that I have really never, heard before, right? You hear people saying, we're tired of the cause, right? As if they have been fighting it themselves for decades, right? Now, we can argue again about how much those countries have paid in the name of Palestine. But I would say to those people that when you say this stuff, it's worth remembering the following. It's not a matter of Palestinian rights in Palestine, because the fact is that I think it's fair to say that that's largely gone, right? It really is about, your rights as a Jordanian, your rights as a Lebanese, your rights as a Syrian, right? As an Egyptian, right? Are you willing to accept the idea that your life, your country, your laws, your nationality are all secondary and worthy of subjugation in the name of another country? That's the question. And I think that for a lot of people, the answer should really be no.
Nabih Bulos, thank you so much for your insights based on your recent observations in both Syria and Lebanon. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for taking the time to join Connections.
Thank you for having me. I hope I didn't blab too much. I really appreciate it.
No, it was really fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.